We're going to talk about your handout, differences in minority status, which is based on the theories of John Ogbu and Cynthia Fordham. And I learned about this when I was doing my doctoral program. And a good theory explains many things, and or many specific sets of things. And when they came up with this theory, they found that it explained things not just in America but in other countries. So I think it's a very interesting theory about how groups of people might act differently based on the treatment they've received. If they're considered a minority because of things that were beyond their control, those are the involuntary or the caste minorities, or if they were a voluntary immigrant, so they came to a country on their own because they wanted to. Okay, so when we look at this in history, that would be the difference between African Americans and the native people that were here. And actually for Hispanic people, a lot of them were already here in this country. One day they were in Mexico, and the next day they were part of the United States and Texas. So I think those are the major groups that we would consider to be the involuntary or the caste minorities, and the voluntary immigrants would be anyone else, anybody Jewish, white, Asian, any immigrants that have come of their own free will, even if they belong to any of those other groups. So the first distinction there, as you look at your handout, is whether or not you had a choice. And if you think about it, like for this class, you have to take this class. I think there's always a little bit of maybe small amount of resentment when you have to do something versus, you want to do something. So think about if you had no choice in moving or you chose. And obviously also the no choice wasn't just no choice, it was more than that. If you were brought, against your will in slavery, that's really no choice and more. And the same thing if you were conquered, if you had been one of the people that were the American Indians, you would have also had those same kinds of issues. Okay, for part two. The second part is, whether or not you have anywhere else to go or whether you can return to your homeland. So for people like the Irish or the Jews, they talk about the return rate. And the return rate was about 10% for the Jews and the Irish, because 10% of the people that came here decided they didn't like it and they went home. If you've ever seen Frank McCourt and Angela's Ashes as a movie, or I've read the book actually, his family did not like America. They went back to Ireland. Actually, they had a lot of problems there, and tuberculosis and, horrible living conditions with sewage in the street. And maybe they shouldn't have gone back, but they decided and they went back so they could leave. But obviously, if you've been brought into slavery or you've been a conquered people, you're not going to have that kind of point, to be able to go somewhere. Okay, so the third part is your foreigner status. Okay, if you come someplace and you immigrate on your own, you're going to expect to be treated somewhat like a foreigner. If I moved to Spain tomorrow and people treat me a little differently than if I was a native Spaniard, I would think, oh, okay, whatever, that's fine. That makes sense. But if you were already living here and then people treat you like you don't belong here, or if someone brings you from another country in slavery and then says, go back to Africa, what are you doing here? So as you can see, that idea of who is a foreigner, that's in quotes, or not, is one of the factors. Okay, the fourth part is how well can you maintain your own culture. So if you come here on your own, voluntarily, you can decide to live someplace where other people who are like you also live. Now, I'm from New York, and it's very interesting to see the ethnic neighborhoods in New York City where, there's a Greek neighborhood, so there's the Greek Orthodox Church, and there's Greek food and whatever, and then there's the Jewish neighborhood, and, there's the synagogue, and signs might be, in Hebrew or whatever. If you're in Chinatown, they're going to be in Chinese. So, people can really focus in, if they want to, on living with people that seem like them, and that also, enables them to eat the food they want to eat, worship the way they want to worship, speak the language they want to speak, etc. And it's kind of interesting if you're in a large city where, there's a confluence of people, and you'll see things like, here's the intersection of a Jewish, Irish, Greek neighborhood, and it says Joe's, Jewish, Irish, Greek food or something. I mean, I really have seen signs that are very similar to that, and it's kind of amusing that you can see the way that, the cultures start to blend. Okay, however, if you are conquered people, or you've been brought against your will, or then maintaining your own culture is difficult, if not impossible. And think about the slaves that were brought here. They were, their names were changed. They were not allowed to practice their native religion. They had to change their language. They basically had to just completely assimilate and accommodate to a new culture. And they weren't even allowed to dance on the plantations. So, and another, the same idea there with American Indians were also, often forced to move from where they had started out. They had to change their whole lifestyle. Their names were changed. If they went to the Indian schools that we'll be talking about later on in the semester, they were forced to go to certain schools. Their religion was changed. Their names were changed. Their language was changed, etc. So you get the idea that maintaining your own culture, if you are in the involuntary or caste minority, is kind of impossible. And the last two parts here, 5 and 6, are the mindsets that go along with that. And the idea of trust. I think it's pretty much obvious that if you're going to go someplace and decide to live somewhere new, you must have at least somewhat of a trust that things are going to go well. Why would you move there if you didn't think they were? Okay, they're going to look out for your welfare or you're not going to go. But if you've been conquered or enslaved, again, I think it just goes without saying that distrust of the dominant culture is what you're going to feel. Okay. So the last one has to do with what kind of a cultural frame you have in relation to the dominant culture. And the dominant culture, at least at this point in America, is kind of the white middle class culture would be considered the dominant culture. Okay, so if we think of the cultural frame as this big wide thing, and this is American culture, whatever. Okay, this is the antithesis of American culture. This is the opposite. All right, if we move here, maybe this is British culture, maybe this is French culture, maybe Chinese culture is over here. Cultures vary, but in terms of being the exact opposite, that's very different. So if they're talking about here that your cultural frame might be different, but not the opposite if you come voluntarily. But if you've been enslaved or conquered, you might say, whatever the dominant culture is doing, I do not want to do that. I'm going to do the opposite. So the dominant culture says, go to school. You might say, I am going to drop out. Or the dominant culture says, you need to move up the corporate ladder and make money a certain way. It might be, well, I'm going to make my money this way on the street. Okay? We're not saying that all people that are African American or Hispanic, if they came here, if their family's been here for a long time, or Native American, have this oppositional cultural frame. But I think there is a potential for people to react to the dominant culture in a very negative way. And I think it's important that we realize that that can happen, because if we don't see that, then we start thinking, oh, that group, again, that's in quote, that group has a problem. Why can't they just be like, quote, us? And we also start looking at the groups that are these voluntary immigrants and saying, why can't these involuntary and caste minorities just be like them? For example, with Asian people, most of them have been more recent immigrants who have come in general voluntarily. And if you've come voluntarily, there's a stereotype of Asians as this model minority. They go to work and they contribute and they're, such good workers. And then people sometimes say, well, why can't black people do that? Or why can't Native people do that? And they say, and they use it as comparison. And I think this is one of the explanations or theoretical explanations of why an immigrant who's voluntary might react very differently to the dominant culture and feel more like they want to become part of this dominant culture or similar to it, and rather than reacting in a way that might say, I don't want to be a part of this dominant culture because I have a lot of distrust and it's based on my involuntary or caste minority status. So you can think about that.